Mambo Team Africa Worldwide. Kwaheri Yayasbui. Good morning. Even if it's night where you are, I'm just going with good morning these days. I am happy to be here with you. My name once again is your brother Konate. Today's topic is going to be whether or not Africa is a country or a continent. Now, a lot of people might think that this is a settled topic, and what the hell is he talking about? Well, let me explain something to you. A landmass can be both a continent and a country. Have you ever heard of Australia? Of course you've heard of Australia. Australia is both a country and a continent. Nobody ever says Australia is not a country, it's a whole continent. People do this with Africa. They think they're being so smart. They think they're being so very intelligent. Oh, it has 50 countries, 52 countries, 54 countries, whoever you might want to ask. Do you know why this number is even up to debate, whether or not Africa has 50 countries or 52 countries or 54 countries? It's because those borders are all made up. Those borders are current. I mean, we just got a new country in Africa in less than a year ago. South Sudan broke away from Sudan. What we have to understand is there was a meeting upon Europeans called the Berlin Conference. Look that up, the Berlin Conference. And this meeting, and I said this in another video, but I'm going deeper at this time. This meeting was held by the European powers so they wouldn't be fighting over the resources of Africa among themselves. So they partitioned it, and they gave, and they decided which European powers was going to control which parts of Africa. Okay, and they drew all of these imaginary borders. There were people who were in families. One day you're in the same town, and then the next day white man drew a line in between it, and now you are two different countries. And they have a history of doing this all over the globe. So after the independence movement in Africa, when the colonial powers pushed out the colonial rulers, the European governors, back into Europe, and they set up the independent African governments, which was quasi-independent because we know they just went from a state of colonialism to neo-colonialism, meaning that they have these African leaders who don't have the best interests of the people at heart, and they just do the bidding of the formal colonial masters. Okay, so when this time period took place, they began to name all of these territories or nations based on the borders that were set up by the Europeans. And some of them, they gave them new names, and some of them they used the names that the Europeans were using. But if you check the map, and a post-colonization map or African independence map, you will see the years in which each one of the modern day African nations obtained their independence. And none of them are, that I know of, are older than 1950. Now you have Ethiopia that was never colonized. But everywhere else, they have an independence date that their countries aren't, none of their countries are over 60 years old. Okay, so you got to understand that all this is made up by the enemy. So stop thinking you're being so intelligent when you're talking about how many countries Africa has. Okay, because prior to colonialization, there were only about 10 kingdoms. And I know you have all these different tribes, whatever, within the kingdoms, but there was really only about 10 kingdoms in all of Africa. Okay, and the problem with all of this is that Africa would have never been colonized, and my people would have never had to deal with the kidnapping and forced labor had African people saw themselves as one nation. I'm about to make my second trip to East Africa at the end of the week. I'm going to Nairobi. Last time I went to Mombasa, and I've studied Africa. I've been studying Africa for over 20 years, and people want to point out all the differences between so-called tribes. It's actually way more similarities than there are differences. And I learned through DNA that most of these tribes are genetically the exact same people, such as the Hausa, the Fulani, and the Takar. Those are all the same people. All they did was divide themselves amongst culture, which is they may have a different, a slightly different way they speak their language, another dialect. They say they have all these different languages. A lot of times, different languages are not different languages. They're just different dialects of the same language. They may have a little bit disagreement about religion, and they may cook a little different, or they may dance a little different, but genetically they're the exact same people, most of these tribes. So but the difference between African people and the rest of the world, we have never grasped the concept of unity based on similarity and skin color. And this is the reason why we are in last place. I mean, it may seem very humanitarian to take that point of view, but what is the result of being a humanitarian? It's the result of being bottom on the bottom status, bottom shelf in current history in the world. Africans, we are nice to everybody but one another. And so we have to understand, when I say Africa, Africa is not just on the continent of Africa. It also includes the diaspora. It includes Africans that were dispersed through the slave trade and through immigration throughout the rest of the world. So, you know, even though I'm not physically in Africa at this moment, I'm in the D. We're in the middle of a snowstorm. You probably see the snow going down. I'm trying to hurry up and finish this video before I lose all my light. But we need to see ourselves as one people. Julius Malema in South Africa, he's a party leader in South Africa. He speaks about this. He has suggested a United States of Africa. That's what we need. If you think about it, the United States is really a collection of 50 nations almost. But instead of calling them nations, they just call them states. But back in the day, a state and a nation was the same thing. So we're United States. It's almost like we're united countries. But we all refer to the United States as being one country. And so we should take that same concept with Africa. Now, I know there's a big division between so-called North Africa and the rest of Africa, which I refuse to call sub-Saharan Africa, because I think sub-Saharan Africa is a racist term. But maybe we want to rename so-called sub-Saharan Africa as the United States of Africa, or just Africa. And then Egypt, Libya, and all those other countries, they can continue being what they are. But African people, and I'm talking about specifically black African people, because I think that's the only type of African there is. I don't care if your family has been in Africa for 6 generations. If you came there via Europe, you're still a European to me. You're not African. If you are from the Middle East, but your DNA has been mixed to the point where you no longer look like an African, you're not African. You know, you're an invader. So when I speak of African, I'm talking about black Africans. That's the only type of African there is to me. We need to stop all this tribal bickering. We need to stop recognizing all of these fictitious borders. And I think there's work in the midst. I know about the East African community, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, South Sudan, and I'm leaving out a couple. I think they have the East African community, and they're attempting to form one nation, which is great. And then a lot of the countries, I believe Ethiopia and I'm pretty sure Kenya, they have open borders from other Africans. Other people from other African nations can come to Kenya without a visa, I believe. But this is what we need to do. We need a United States of Africa. We need to start unifying around the concept of one Africa, one people. I mean, if you do the research, you will find out that the Bantu peoples mixed with almost everybody. And then if you talk about, like, for instance, if you talk about the Hassas and the Fulani, I'm not sure if those are Bantus, but those are nomadic peoples, and they spread throughout most of the continent. If you notice that a lot of things that African Americans do, I noticed I've been studying Kiswahili, and there are a lot of English words in Kiswahili, the loan words from English, and those words, most of those words, those are pronounced the exact same way that African Americans naturally say the words, until we're exposed to the American education system and they teach us that we're speaking improperly and that we need to speak proper English when there's no such thing as proper English. But they make us feel inferior when we speak English in a way that is more natural for our vocal cords and our lips. It's like, for example, the month of December, it's a lot easier to say December. Well, in Kiswahili, December is the word for December. You understand what I'm saying? And with all that space in between us, African Americans and Kenyans on East Africa, we will pronounce that word exactly the same if we're speaking naturally. So there's only one Africa. I only recognize one Africa, one people. There's a country of Africa, there's a nation of Africa, and everything else is just a temporary division. And I hope that made sense to people. And that's what we need to aim for. We need to unify. Lack of unity is the only problem that we actually have. You can name all these other problems: education, unwanted pregnancy, poverty, crime, male-female relationships. I don't care what you try to bring up as a problem in the African American community.